could we perhaps get into it by backtracking a bit to Yellen? How important do you think it is for markets to answer this question of uninsured deposits?
It's important because they're obsessed about it. It's a little bit circular. Look, ultimately, what policymakers did the weekend of Silicon Valley banking going down showed that they're willing to do whatever is needed to stop a systemic crisis and to guarantee those deposits. But what she has reiterated is she's going to wait till they're forced into that corner. They're not going to try getting ahead of that story. And I feel that's like a bit like a red flag to a bull in terms of traders might try to target that by putting pressure on those most vulnerable regional US banks. Now, the US still has more than 4,000 banks. Banks go bankrupt in the US all the time. There's been more than 500 bankruptcies so far this century, in the last 22 years. So it's not particularly rare, but we are going to be putting pressure on them. And I think that Yellen has made that clear. What does this mean for broader markets? There's not a systemic risk out there. The globally systemic important banks are not vulnerable. And ultimately, if enough smaller banks are vulnerable, they'll step in. But it does create problems about unfairness and why there is their two-tier system. And importantly for markets, it's going to raise the cost of funding, particularly for the smaller banks and smaller companies.
But I just go back to this thing, Mark, Yellen can't really say there's blanket insurance. It's going to cause a legal headache. It needs to go through Congress, and basically nothing can really go through Congress at the moment. So, she can't say something like that.
Look, that's absolutely fair. And I said, I don't really even think it's necessary. Like, we've got to remember that Silicon Valley Bank was quite unique. The size of deposits were large. The average deposit there, I think, was over $4 million, and like kind of 20 times as large as the average deposit in many of these regional banks. Where for most depositors, it doesn't matter that you can't get above the $250,000 deposit. Most people don't have $250,000 lying around in their bank not being used. So Silicon Valley Bank was a little bit of a rare exception here. So this is a story which is only relevant because the world has made it a story and become obsessed for clarification. And I realize that puts Yellen in a tough spot, but ultimately people need to move beyond this because there's not a systemic banking crisis out there.
Well, Mark, we're just out of time here, but I was going to ask you about UK inflation, but I know you broke those numbers yesterday, so I would just advise everyone to go back and listen to the top of the show from yesterday ahead of the BOE decision. Remember, you can always get up-to-date analysis from Mark and the rest of the MLive team. MLive Go is where you want to head to on your terminal.